Hello, everybody, for our staggering number of live viewers. I am Kyle Cordes at Oasis Digital. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
I'm Lance Finney, also with Oasis Digital.
Zachary Kipping, also with Oasis Digital.
And David Moore, also with Oasis Digital.
So this is our every 2 to 4 week kind of talk show. Often it's pretty broad for all the technology we touch, but this time it's going to be very Angular centric. So if you don't care about Angular, you're probably not going to get a lot out of this time, but our Angular viewers probably will. Our big topic that we'll get to in a few minutes is we're going to kind of dig through a bunch of examples from our curriculum that we teach with, and we're going to use those to point out some Angular tips. Just bits and pieces that have made their way in there that we're like, well, I'm not sure everybody knows this, but it's really helpful to know. But always, before we start to our big thing, we try to kind of talk about news of the week. And I think, Lance, you just shared a tweet about some interesting Angular news, right? What was that?
Yeah, let me find the tweet and I'll add it to the chat. It was a tweet that they fixed in Stack Blitz. They fixed being able to use RxJS 7 so that the typing all works for that. I know that it caused trouble for a couple of people on this chat. And Ben Lesh tweeted that out this morning, and there was much rejoicing.
I was rejoicing. I've been interviewing using Stack Blitz, and it's really frustrating in an interview when someone is typing valid code and they get a type error. That is not a great interview experience. Have you guys?
It's made my last 2 weeks kind of a pain. I've been doing a lot of proof of concepts in Stack Blitz, and they're all pretty RxJS heavy, and not having great typing support was a big struggle. I almost dropped using Stack Blitz a couple times just to do it in VS Code or something. Like I didn't want to do it in our code base because just going to be a proof of concept. Didn't want anything else like outside coming in. Yeah, it was pretty rough. I'm really glad it's fixed.
The Stack Blitz folks, they have a hard road to walk because like the quality of their tool is often going to be assessed by does it work with the current tools that you're using with it, right? And so, you have no reason when you just grab Stack Blitz to try something to think, oh, I'm using so-and-so library, I need to go to an old version, right? And so as a user, you're mostly just going to pick it up and assume that whatever is current, Stack Blitz kind of lives in the eternal now. So whatever current, you're going to assume it works.
Yeah, I don't use Stack Blitz very often. Like my assumption, and this might be multiple people's assumption, is that when you pull in a library, that would be in your node modules that would normally have typing in any other IDE, that it would just pick up that typing. But Absolutely. I'm guessing that's not the case, or at least not yet.
Well, I think there's like a small asterisk. It's mostly the case, but there's a couple of rough edges where they occasionally have to adjust things. So I think that's actually really exciting news because it affects work that we do quite regularly. Then we had another piece of news to talk about. Oh, I think several of us here have been going through Angular plus NX upgrades on complex projects. I think David, you said you had some experiences you wanted to talk about there.
Yeah, it took about a month. Because the project that I was updating was quite large. And there's a lot of, with some of the things that happen in NX plus Angular 12 are, updates for things like Prettier, updates for things like ESLint, both of which, going from TSLint to ESLint, a lot of linting and formatting changes happened, but the biggest thing that hit me was, second biggest thing that hit me was typing is much more strict, or can be. Yeah. And so it's especially like template typing. And if your typing if you've been just okay for now and haven't been too concerned about typing, and then suddenly it gets more strict, that can really kind of mess you up in terms of compilations.
I've been upgrading projects along that same path, and the one that I'm working with at the moment is actually an embarrassing acknowledgement, still on TSLint. But all the other things you just described, yes, I'm I've hit all of those and greatly enjoyed. Can I think of a search and replace to fix a whole bunch of code? I know that
Yep.
some of the upgrades that happen, you get upgrade schematics to help with,
Yeah.
but those are, they're obviously not even attempting to cover all the different ways you have to update code to be compatible with new versions.
Yeah, and there was actually a thing with like the prettier formatting was attempting to format, I think, HTML, and I ended up running into an issue where it was actually breaking the HTML because of the way that things were wrapped or whatever. Or not, no, sorry, it was in the TypeScript. It was noticing that the error was at the wrong position in the line, and so it would make a change at the position it thought it was, but it wasn't. And so I had to do a lot of find but not replace. I had to replace manually.
Yeah.
So it gave me a list to fix, but it wasn't an easy fix.
So there's a very, very old issue in the GitHub project for Visual Studio Code. People asking, hey, the other IDEs I use show me all the errors found in all of my files, and VS Code doesn't show me the errors until I open that file. What gives? I think there's reasons that they're trying to avoid Visual Studio Code becoming the same sluggish experience that you get with whatever you were using that caused you to move to Visual Studio Code. So there's good reasons why, but sometimes you just desperately need it. And so I was having this exact same case. So David, I was actually running I almost thought never run commands inside the Visual Studio Code terminal, because until recently, that would be a problem when you needed to restart Visual Studio Code. So I always ran them externally, and I actually switched to running my build commands internally so that I could click easily on the error messages to go through hundreds of error messages throughout a large project. Figuring out, okay, what's the way to fix this problem that will make the types pass, won't change the semantics, and will be least controversial to the other people working on the project.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I did mention that was my second biggest hurdle. My biggest hurdle was actually dealing with, since Angular 12 is full Ivy, a lot of, even though there's NGCC running as the post install, I've got all that set up and have for the last couple of versions. For some reason, even an Angular 11 project broke with it. Which I'm not sure why, but there were several. When you run it, if you've ever run into this, you know what I'm talking about. There's like an emod or omod error. When I say emod, it's actually a special character. It's a non-English character.
It's a theta or something like
it's
that.
It's not a theta. Go ahead.
It looks a little bit like it. It looks a little bit like a
that.
theta, but it's not. But it turns out that it's based on that error is for dependency injection or importing of certain modules is when you'll get that thrown. And the way I had to debug it was figure out what was causing the error, literally comment out almost all of that file until I stopped getting the error, and then reinserting the rest of that file until I got the error so that I could figure out what import was breaking. Then I went to wherever that was, did the same thing, 2-3 files deep, finally figured out that it was in my case, it was a node module Angular library that was still on Angular 7. That was 3 years old. And so NGCC evidently didn't fully compile it so that it was compatible with Angular 12 and Ivy. And I was able to, luckily, a fork of that project had been made and had upgraded it to Angular 10, but compatible with Ivy. And that just worked. And it fixed 90% of the remaining problems that I had.
So the thing that this will be our first tip, in fact. So I guess we're transitioning into our main topic now. That'll be our tips. So what we're going to do with our tips is we're going to try to mostly do tips that we can demonstrate the Angular Bootcamp example code. And I guess probably as we look at each example, we'll drop a link into the chat. So anybody following along, we'll get you a link. We welcome questions about anything we bring up and talk about. And we're going to kind of mostly round robin it here. But I'm gonna carry on with what David just brought up for kind of a first tip. Is that the first sub tip is that little character. It looks like a theta, and I thought it was a theta. And I mentioned something about it being a theta somewhere, and it's one of those things where certain things you mention on the internet, like you get a bunch of replies. Well, I got a bunch of replies. It's not a theta, I learned. It is a character called the barred O. It's a letter O with a horizontal bar across. It is not the same. It's a distinct, different Unicode character, and it's like, semantically a different character from a theta. I have absolutely no idea how they chose the barred O. But the second sub-tip of this tip is that if you see that error, you get blah, 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 barred O mod, that almost always means that you somehow have a mix of Ivy and pre-Ivy code that you're trying to compile. Finding where that code is can be really hard, but that is almost always the case. That is what leads you to that problem. There is a different case where if you accidentally import something that's not a module, you can get that error even without using any pre-Ivy code. But generally speaking, if you have some code you're trying to upgrade, and then you keep getting this error, somewhere in your project or dependencies, hopefully not transitive dependencies, there's some pre-Ivy code. So I guess that's the first tip. So I don't care which way we kind of go around. So whoever wants to put up some code and do a tip, that's fine. And then please put up either a link to either the GitHub or maybe directly to the Stack Blitz of the specific code that you're going to show. And then the way it works here, kind of inside baseball for those watching, is if you share your screen, I have to click a button because I'm running the StreamYard meeting to get your screen to show up on the stream. So just proceed, and I will try to follow along.
And while someone's setting that up, the confusion between a theta and a barred O reminds me of a kind of an anti-tip, a prank someone once suggested to look up the Greek question mark. It's a Unicode by itself, and it looks identical to a semicolon. So you can sprinkle that through someone's code, replacing all their semicolons with Greek question marks, and nothing will compile, and no one will see why. That's not really an Angular tip. That's how to be evil.
I mean,
on-space characters are fun too.
It's still a tip. I'm going to rule it in. It's still a tip. Okay, so now that Lance and I have been stalling for time, Zachary or David, do you have a link to offer and a screen to share?
I mean, I can offer our general prep and introduction, but it's not directly from our code, but it's one that I give at the very beginning of all the classes, and I'm surprised at how many people are not aware of it.
Looking to something you can bring up in a Stack Blitz from one of our examples and do a tip about it. So,
I can bring one up.
If it's a really simple one, I mean, if you have to start with literally our very first example, which is a trivial kind of Hello World Angular app, we could totally have legit tips in a Hello World Angular app.
I can bring up one about routing if you want.
Okay, go ahead. And then once I see your screen share, I'll try to juggle things to make it appear.
And you know what? When you have that up, I'll be able to walk you through my tip as well.
Oh, cool.
So we don't have to switch screens.
2 for the price of 1.
Okay.
Okay, and you're definitely going to have to make that font significantly bigger.
Just got it in the Stack Blitz.
For our poor viewers that are... So this is so this link should also appear in the chat. Sometimes I'm not 100% sure if the chat is going to make it to every viewer, but this link that I put on the screen is what Zachary just brought up.
I'm looking at YouTube right now. You need to make it bigger still.
Oh, okay.
That resolves a little bit better.
Yeah.
So, but maybe one more time.
Okay.
It didn't work.
Okay, so area I wanted to focus on, this is again just like one of our basic routing steps. And the thing that always kind of catches people by surprise sometimes, even if they do a lot of routing, is this very first routing object we have in our kind of a routing table or root routing table. And it's this redirecting to stuff, which I always find really interesting. And a lot of times I go like an extra yard of kind of like what I like to refer to as like the sandwich of redirects, of doing like a path star star that redirects to something else as well. So not a lot of people make use of these redirects, and it kind of comes as a surprise to me because they are extremely powerful in terms of like catching everything and going to like a 404 page, or just like not having like that blank empty route inside your rope, or having like a home path essentially.
So
Which is kind of neat.
Go ahead.
yeah, so can you describe what actually happens, what the first one does compared to the last one?
So the first one here, I'll just open up the actual browser here a little bit as well. So this first one basically states that if you're on like just like the flash empty of a route, so like you basically just go into a website for the first time and you're just on like the .com of something, right? Whenever you go to that URL, being annoying. Okay. So whenever I reach the website and I get to that like /nothing, we basically just hit our routing table. And Angular then takes over and says, okay, this path of nothing matches, right? So let's go ahead and redirect to some other path. And that allows for you to kind of just have like a default path in mind, or even a default lazy load of something, which is nice. So in our case, we're lazy loading this HR path. And this also kind of catches people too, which is like this kind of weird extra syntax of like the Pathmatch, which is a weird one to explain all the time. But mostly it's mostly just saying like, hey, we're at the root of our system. An empty string, or just like a string in general, is very eagerly matching on stuff. So almost if you're thinking on like regex or pattern matching or something, an empty string up here is like eagerly matching. It'll basically match anything that comes into it. So the path match of full here basically says it has to be like a full empty string to actually match.
I saw a lot of difficulty with this one line before like everybody was pervasively using type support. You know, I've watched people try to type this and type path match with a lowercase m, and their app is just totally broken. Yeah.
Thankfully nowadays though, like if you don't include that on the root and you have this like redirect with an empty path, Angular does like spit out an error saying, hey, you configured this improperly. They literally give you the thing to copy paste, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, it's one of the things I really like about Angular when they, a lot of times they'll spit out good errors or good warnings to help you along at runtime.
Yeah.
And then this, as opposed to something like on the bottom here, so line 22, like using the kind of catch-all wildcards here for the final path in a tree is really nice if you just want to have either redirect them to the happy path if they misspell something, or like redirect them to like a 404 page if like one of your pages got removed, one of your routes got removed, but someone still had it bookmarked. You can 404 them, say like, hey, this doesn't exist anymore. Do you want to go to the homepage? Yada, yada. So it's also really nice to have as well. And I kind of refer to it as like the sandwich of redirecting. So
I have a question. Since you said that the first one at the beginning, if you didn't do the path match full, like bad things would happen, right? Like the empty one would act like a wild card. On line 22, could you use the empty one as your wild card? I'm like,
and then not use path match full.
Yeah, like I'm trying to figure out. It's like you have to use an explicit.
Oh, either way, it's going to error out if you don't.
So they have it set up that it's like force you to use an explicit wildcard if you meant to wildcard things.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
At least at the root of the application, like the root, an empty string is dangerous. You can use empty strings in your path like deeper down if you're using lazy loading or nested routing. But just at the root, it's dangerous and it always errors out unless you have a path match. Yeah. I think you can do an explicit path match of the prefix. And it won't error out anymore, but you have to like specify that you want to go down the dangerous path.
So you maybe could get by using an empty one with a prefix as your wild card, but that wouldn't be very idiomatic.
Yeah. It's like having a switch map statement without breaks that fall through. It's like, was it intended to fall through, or are you missing a break? That's why linters go crazy on, falling through switch case statements.
Yeah, I basically treat, and like the ordering of this is important too, because if you have this path matching higher, then it's always going to hit that versus the payroll. So ordering and also these like redirects are crazy important on these tables, or basically switch cases.
Yep.
So is that it for that tip? Ready for our next tip?
Yeah, I think so. I think Lance might want to take over. So
Yeah, I just have a short one that
On
we
this
can
same one?
we'll sandwich it in between you and Lance, which is just if you can open up your dev tools in Chrome.
You want his DevTools
Just
open
actual
on
dev tools.
StackBlitz? Because I have another tip also. Go ahead.
If you go to network, the disable cache, that's one that isn't always checked. I think it remembers if you've checked it before, but it's disable cache while DevTools is open. So the browser will cache commonly loaded stuff and reload it. And when you're doing development, you're constantly reloading. So you don't want to use the cached copy. So DevTools allows you to disable it as long as you have DevTools open. It won't use any memory or disk caching for anything that's downloaded. Like over my years as a web developer, there's probably days of lost time because it was you pulling the cache. And this is one that I always bring up during class.
So I have two more tips that stack on top of your tip, David. The first is that button right there is a Heisenbug. It leads directly to Heisenbugs. Hey, my app only works correctly when I have the DevTools up, but then when I turn off my DevTools, my app starts breaking. I've actually had error reports of that type. It was because when caching was off, the app behaved correctly, and they had their DevTools set so that I thought I was just observing my program by opening DevTools, but I was actually changing the behavior of my program by opening DevTools, which isn't that I thought that's just wild that you get that effect. And then the second one was StackBlitz is because it's running in the browser, it kind of creates this question, when I bring up the console, what's happening? And so when you bring up these dev tools, the challenge here is that you're actually dev tooling StackBlitz, which is itself quite an interesting but complex and large web application. And so if you're trying to spot how your application is behaving inside StackBlitz, bringing up the browser level dev tools is a lousy way to do that. So it looks like, Zachary, are you demoing the way to do it here? Yeah, so if you really want to use the dev tools on your app only, you need to pop out the application into a separate window in StackBlitz, as Zachary just showed how, and then your dev tools are pointing only at your application, not pointing at all of StackBlitz itself. So hopefully David and I both jumping in hasn't caused Lance to forget what his tip was.
Nope, no problem. Another tip, it's also on the same step, app routing module. If you could open up the app component HTML. So this is a little thing that perhaps I didn't know until I started teaching this class, but I have seen other people talk on Twitter, GDEs talk about how they learned about this thing. And it's always been there with Angular, but people for some reason just miss it, like I did. Router link active, which is on lines 5 and 8. The green that we have around the word HR right now, and if Zachary clicks on the payroll, the green that moves over to payroll, it can be pretty hard to figure out how to get that on there unless you know about router link active. And really all this says is when the router is set to /HR, because of what we see on line 6, then it adds the class of green background to that LI. And if we are routed to /payroll instead, then it adds the class green background to the other LI. And then you can do whatever you want to do with that class. But it's a very simple way of getting a class added to your element if you are routed to that element. And it's just one of those things it's a nice little feature of Angular that people sometimes miss.
Yeah, I've actually seen projects where they didn't know about router link active and then had to go into the TypeScript and listen to the actual router in the components that needed to do things and then set flags and do other stuff and then had ng class. Like between 5 and 20 lines of code that is just one line here.
this feature has been in Angular since I think version 4 or even version 2. But yeah, it's definitely not widely known. This is one of those ones where we have folks that attend our class who have been, maybe been using Angular for a year and are grumpy that their boss sent their entire team to our class, confident they will not learn anything. And we always say, well, every time we look at somebody else's code, we learn something, and that probably applies to other people too. And so you pull up this code, and this is like almost at the beginning. This is quite early in the class, right, Zachary?
Yeah,
Like
this is
step 5 or
105.
something.
Yeah, so it's like the morning of the first day probably. And this is like a really interesting, valuable little built-in thing that's just not widely known. So my lawn mowing person had chosen right now to mow in front of my office. So I will go on mute and let the next person share their screen for the next step.
Yeah, I'm looking through our curriculum, trying to figure
Worst
out what I
case,
want to
I can
highlight.
share
Right?
another. I was just going to share which stuff? 205 if someone wanted to do that one. So doing like the class dot syntax, I feel like a lot of people on projects I've seen don't know about that, and they always use ng class or whatever, and do like the harder syntax when there's something a lot easier.
Yeah. Are you going to share your screen for that?
I can if you want me to. I was going to give someone else a chance, but
Go ahead.
okay, let me do it again.
Yeah, it's one of those things that Angular that I like about Angular, but can also be really confusing. Is there's multiple ways to do the same thing. So like what Zachary's about to show is one way to do it. He also mentioned ng class. There's more than one way to skin a cat, as it were.
And they all have their use cases.
Sometimes this is all you need, but then if you extrapolate it and go, well, what if I have 15 of these? Well, that's when you might want to have ng class and a method.
Yeah, it really depends on the kind of circumstances, really. So a lot of times, I see a lot of people making use of ng class, like David just mentioned, and it's really ng class is awesome for like kind of compiling the names, like at runtime, basically just generating the name of a class you need to use. But if you already kind of know the name of the class you need to apply before any of your logic take place in terms of like booleans or conditions or whatever, it's a really nice syntax, a very clean syntax to be able to just do class dot whatever, to be able to say conditionally add or remove this class to some element. Same thing kind of goes for the styling bindings as well, but those are used slightly less often because direct style bindings are pretty frowned upon.
A lot of designers will wag their finger at you if you use direct style bindings.
But the class dot one is a lot more useful in terms of just generally like actual development work, since you apply classes every day. If you need to generically or kind of conditionally apply one, it's really nice, especially for any kind of reusable components.
So I have seen a tweet or two in the last couple of weeks about the style bindings of people being surprised that you can do percentage and pixels and specify right in there. And so that's, I think, worth highlighting here. On line 39, if record rank is greater or equal to 7, then the class of fired will get added. But then on line 39, record units times unit scale, whatever that number is, that's the percentage that will be added for the style width. But you could also do that as pixels, and I forget what other things, but like it's
basically all the units.
Yeah.
What's that?
I think
we kind of with like rims, pixels, EMs. You can basically do it with all the
any CSS unit. Yep.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful there. Again, not, as David said, it's not always the best thing to do, but there are times, like in this motivated example, where it is the right thing.
Yeah, like in this particular one, we're setting the width to show a bar. You can't really do that without generating, infinite number of classes for however many, however long your bar is going to be. So this is when you would use style.
Yeah, I mean the bindings are here for doing something with a variable, right? And so the complaint that you shouldn't use a style in line, well, like there's not a way to do a binding inside a CSS file, at least not in Angular today. I mean, I guess you could write some code to bind to a CSS variable somewhere and then use that CSS variable at the point of use, but it would be a long way around. So I think that the complaints that we sometimes get, oh, you shouldn't be using styles in line, I don't think those really apply to cases where you're dynamically setting the style based on some values. I also have a meta tip on this one, and that is kind of the underlying idea behind, I think Zachary said, if you know the name of the class, just use the syntax. And that is, as a meta tip, only reach as deep into the toolbox as you need, motivated by the problem you have before you. So although it is true you could use ng class, which is this very more dynamic, more powerful thing, because you can do class names that are unknown at compile time, for example. If you do that, you're creating more overhead for people to understand. Like if I'm reading line 30, I have no way of knowing what class names might get applied here. I have to go study other code. But if I study lines 28 and 29, I know exactly what classes might get applied here. And so this is both easier to do, which nicer syntax, and it's a lot nicer to the human behind you as to read the code.
Yeah, this hits a couple of different, I could call them pet peeves, or I could call them pro tips. A lot of times, a lot of devs that I've met, myself included, will overcomplicate things of like, I'm going to do the perfect solution here and just write a huge amount of stuff for future proofing and such. So an ng class would do everything you might ever need in the future. But, to Kyle's point, it becomes super hard to read, hard to maintain. Whereas sometimes just reaching for the really simple tool is, class dot bonus. I wonder what that does. It probably applies the bonus class. And, we spend 90% of our time reading code, throwing out one of the aphorisms, but we spend a huge amount of our time reading code, not actually writing brand new code. And so being able to read this and instantly know what you're doing, and just make a very quick change, like if our bonus was record rank equals 2 instead of 1, that's a 1 character change that we didn't have to read very far in to make that change. So yeah, it hits a couple of different things. Doing it this way and or ng class, definitely go for the simple, unless you know for certain, like it is your current duty to write a more comprehensive thing like an ng class method.
I don't know if anyone else has anything with this, but as another side tip that skirts around the same functionality. Recently, I've been doing a lot of directive work, and ironically, this same syntax comes into play if you're doing host bindings as well. Like you can do a host binding on a class dot whatever or a style dot whatever, and that's extremely powerful when it's coming straight from your TypeScript based on a variable or a getter function. That's really nice as well if you're doing a lot of directive work. You can do the same thing with components as well, but I've noticed it a lot when I've been doing directives. So kind of conditionally apply classes to the element the directive is on based on a getter function or just a true or false variable. It's really cool.
I kind of feel like we could do an entire Angular bootcamp after hours.
Yeah.
Where it's we just take the same code and we talk about all the sort of side discussions that go off from it, stuff that we might kind of avoid. Like if somebody comes and pays their money and takes the class, we try really hard to stay focused on the point of this example, what we're trying to teach to a possibly relatively new Angular developer in this example. And it's kind of fun to sit here and just sort of riff off to the side and oh yeah, this comes in mind because I do directives, which if you were teaching it, that would be something the person might not have even heard of yet. But in this tip context, it's so much fun. So now I'm looking, is there anything else in here to say that's just totally, would never distract a group if they were paying customers, but we can because they're just watching our video podcast.
One thing that comes up is I'm a little nervous about line 30, and I'm not sure if I should be. Is there a potential performance hit from having a function call there? Because Angular, I know if I have an ngIf with a function call, that Angular has to look into that to see whether it is applied. That an advantage, I definitely don't have to worry about that on line 29 with class.fired, because Angular can just look at record.rank and it knows what that value is, and it will know if it needs to recalculate it. But doesn't Angular, when you're using this standard change detection, have to recall that
Yes.
function all the time? And so that's
Yeah.
a potential performance issue?
On every change detection, it will call that function. And so this is only safe if it's a function that's like so small you might have been willing to write it in line anyway.
Yeah. So that is one of the other things that I would not go into depth when we are teaching step 205 or whatever this is, because we haven't gotten anywhere near change detection. But just that is another reason to prefer the class dot binding syntax instead of ng class.
Yeah, and it could be really confusing that early in the class, because is it really a performance increase? Lance, you said it could be, and in this case, it probably wouldn't be. But if we had 500 different components, 500 iterations of this component on the screen, and they were all checking ng class multiple times, then if I've worked on projects where real-time updates were very, very important, so your code has to be very performant, and this could drag down that performance in cases like that. But in your everyday normal app, you probably don't need to worry about it.
Yeah.
But it is something good to know, because you might be on one of those projects one day.
So for Angular, it's either, I'm not sure if it's 12.2 or maybe it's for the 13 alpha that's underway now. They've actually added a function call pipe. And so if you have this situation, you could call this function via a function called pipe, and that I think is a pure pipe, in that it will only recall the function if the inputs to the function have changed. So there is a new coming way. Now I am hesitant to recommend using a function called pipe. It seems like yet another thing for someone to sort of groan at, why is there so much complexity in this template? But it is good that it is now available off the shelf, or will soon be available off the shelf.
Yeah, hopefully they would then be able to figure out a way to kind of sweep it away and just use it automatically without extra syntax.
You can imagine an Angular that actually parsed the contents of that expression and understood it was a function call and automatically did the function call pipe, but the actual Angular does not do that, unfortunately.
Right.
We've got a lot of tips from this little snippet of code. Is there anything more on this one, or does somebody have another piece to bring up?
The only other thing that comes to mind right now is the difference between the brackets around ng class and the brackets around class. And I think we even have a comment in here somewhere about that. Both of them can be useful, but one thing to keep in mind is that if you just put brackets around class and then have a function call, it will blow away any other classes that you have assigned to that element. So if we have this and then the region class in there, and we get rid of the ng class, the bonus and the fired classes will get blown away, because class is the heavy hammer that blows away anything else. If you want to be able to have something where that uses class dot binding and play well with adding other things to it, that's where ng class comes into play.
So
removing.
Here's a question.
Yeah.
Why does the Angular template compile? So line 30, you should never do that, right?
It's destructive, basically.
So why does the Angular template compiler even allow it, instead of spitting out an error that says you can't do that? Don't
you
do
can
that.
put square brackets around anything.
Yeah, you can bind to any attribute.
They wrote the compiler though. They could
put that in as a extra case, but then it makes Angular harder to maintain. For these edge cases or special cases.
There are so many things that they are already dealing with. I don't see how one more would ever.
Yeah.
So
maybe it was to give us the opportunity to
to have this discussion.
To have this discussion, or just as a developer to choose which one we want.
Yeah, I've seen a fair share of code that does do the binding on class, but they're not dealing with other with things that they don't have to work like in this case here, employee-name, that class would get blown away as soon as that binding fired. And I've seen code where they didn't care. I've also seen code where they went, oh, stuff got blown away. And because they didn't know about ng class, or they didn't know about class.bonus or class.fired, class dot whatever CSS class name, because they didn't know about those, they had to put all of the classes and add and remove those in that method so that they wouldn't accidentally blow things away.
So they'd have to put the static things like employee name in there along with the dynamically calculated things. Yeah.
Yep, and it would always be returned rather than using ng class and then just having a class with employee dash name.
And that goes straight, right? So that means that the fact that Angular doesn't block you from doing the bad thing, like that cost that team a non-trivial amount of time and money. So hence my suggestion, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe instead of letting you do things and hoping that you make it to Angular Bootcamp and learn not to, it would maybe be better if it just blocked when you did the unwise thing.
It makes sense. I mean, they are slowly going down that path because, even in the previous example with the routing bits and the Pathmatch, they used to just let you completely mess up your application until you figured it out.
And now it helps you.
So now they're actually going down the path and having better errors and stuff. So maybe that might come about. Who knows?
So this is not quite a tip, but I think it might lead to one. Could you take line 30 back out because it's the bogus one. So if you wanted to write ng class, like let's say there was no ng class and you wanted to write one, I believe you could because that's just a directive. Do you know, is there a way to write your own custom directive that works like lines 28, 29, 37, 38, 39? Like, is there a way to write your own directive that has some little dot something syntax in the binding part? Like if I wanted to create my own mechanism, let's say I wanted to create some syntax for, I don't know, internationalization, where it would come in handy to do a binding that had a something dot something. Yeah. Does anybody know? Is that possible?
I18n dot plural or something. I have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of wonder. Anyway, so it's fine if we don't know, because we don't know.
Unfortunately, I'm double booked, so I have to step away.
Did you get your best tips in, David?
I got the best ones in.
Fantastic.
I got the ones that have made me spend the most of my time, and I'm hoping by sharing them, others won't spend as much time as I had to. So,
well, thank you for bringing your tips.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks,
bye,
everyone.
David. And then I have a tip. I haven't done a share yet here. Let's see if I can figure out how. I got to pick the right tab out of a vast list. Trying to figure out why I don't see. Oh, interesting. When you go to share a tab, you only see the title of the tab. And so if you have two different tabs open that have the same title, then
all the
there's no way.
StackBlitz is just named StackBlitz.
Yeah, I have multiple StackBlitzes open and ready. Like, oh, I think I'm going to share this StackBlitz, but no. Okay, so let's get this one up. So this is an example we have that involves doing a resolve for a route guard, but that's not what we're going to talk about here, unless somebody has a tip that involves resolves. It's not sharing? Okay, let me try to click one more thing. Okay, now it's sharing.
Okay.
Okay, so let me put the link in here in case anyone wants to look. I'll just have the main. There we go. So this is the link. And this example is about using a resolve with a route guard, but that's not what I'm going to talk about for my tip. What I talk about for my tip is this little bit right here. This line, just this line 3, this pattern. Put either a DOM element or a container, and then ngIf, take an observable, pipe async as local variable name. There is so much variation in both familiarity and use of this one construct among teams. It is really surprising. So there are folks who never do this at all. They literally did not know that this existed. There are folks who do this part, but they've never done an as. There's actually a different syntax where you can do a let at the beginning. It's like a little bit longer syntax. It's like the older syntax. There are folks who do this, but they always give it the same name, which you can do. You can do that. It is legal to use the
Yeah.
same name.
And I have
Scary,
gotten
though.
yelled at on videos
And
because
the
of that
inner
conversation.
one shadows the outer one. There are folks who, when they go to do this, they cannot think of a name to type here. And so they always use the same name, but then they go back and put a $sign on the outer one, then they go edit all their other code to use the $sign on the outer one. Like, I've seen all of these things in real projects, every variation of this. So my tip is become super familiar with line 3, use it everywhere it's even slightly applicable, and get good at naming so that you can like come up with a good local name for the thing that won't be the exact same as the name that's coming in from the component, because it really is quite confusing if you use the exact same name. I am actually pretty tolerant of short names, so I'm okay even using just like a single line identifier. Like when I started developing, single character identifiers were quite common. So I'm comfortable even just using a single character, a well-chosen single character. But even for those that aren't, this pattern, this is like just an incredibly valuable tip for any code that has data coming in via an observable.
So I was thinking about something similar to this, but I'm going to take a step back. An important tip: use the async pipe. So, Kyle is saying, once you're using the async pipe, let's talk about how to use it, but make sure you use the async pipe. If you are using observables, or even if you're using promises and you want to get that information on the screen, don't do a subscribe to grab the value out to put into a scalar variable to get it on the screen, or something like that, because you end up having to manage that subscription, or you have, if you don't, you end up with memory leaks. This async pipe means that Angular will handle for you the life cycle of your observable, so it will do the subscription and the unsubscription for you, and it makes your life and your code so much easier than a life of Angular without the async pipe.
Yeah, there was a tip buried in there, Lance, that the async pipe works with promises also.
Don't use it as much, but it does work. Yeah.
Yeah, but if especially on systems that are bringing in some, maybe some API that's used broadly across the company, and that API is promise based, you don't have to do anything special. You can just take that promise and just immediately directly use it with the async pipe. It's almost hard to learn because there's nothing to learn. It just already works. And so there's not a syntax to learn. There's not an example to go look at. Just if this thing is a promise, the async pipe will get the data from it and pass it along.
Yeah.
As another, I guess, tip within a tip within a tip. On this one, I always try to hone into people to try and componentize things as much as possible, because you can almost kind of circumnavigate the needing to name this as variable with the ngIf syntax if you just use an async pipe on an input. So in this case, you might componentize that entire chunk with an ng container, and then you just async pipe that data into it, and you get a best of both worlds, right? I'm making use of the async pipe, I mentioned, really good tip, but I also get the side effect of I now get to deal with my data in a static way inside another component, which is nice.
Yeah. Well, and another aspect of this is, I don't know if everyone knows about ng container. The point of ng container is if you want to have something to do a structural directive, a structural change to your application like this ngIf, but you don't actually want the thing that you're wrapping around it to add another layer to your DOM. You're not trying to add another div around things. Use ng container. It will allow you to do ngIf, ng4, those sorts of things without changing the structure of your DOM.
Also, again, I guess another note, complete side path to what we're talking about right now, actually. Talking about the ngIf syntax, this is a little bit more verbose since we're using a pipe and we're using the as, so creating another template variable. But there is an else syntax that I don't see people use a ton.
That's true.
And I see a lot of people do ngIf this Boolean expression, ngIf the opposite of this Boolean expression. And that can work sometimes if you don't it just kind of depends on your situation, but there is an actual else syntax that is really nice for displaying a separate chunk of template. So you don't have to like copy paste a whole bunch of condition for another GIF.
We've actually intentionally de-emphasized that in our teaching of Angular because, I mean, everything has its strengths and weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to acknowledge the kind of excessive noisiness of doing an else is not one of Angular's strengths.
Yeah,
it has many, and the else syntax is not one of them.
Because it's an ng template that you have to bring in order to do that, right?
That part's a little bit weird, but
Yeah.
It just kind of depends on the situation. Like I'm perfectly fine with people doing like an ngf, another ngf, if the condition's super simple.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, if you're having to like copy paste a huge verbose thing, sometimes it can be just easier to take bite the bullet basically and use that ng template and kind of do it that way.
Yeah, if it's a complicated Boolean expression, or if you're doing it on something through the async pipe, it's better to use the else. But because of the chattiness of adding the ng template, I tend not to do it, but I do know that it's there.
Yeah. Well, I can bring up another tip, or if one of you guys wants to switch, I'll relinquish the share, and you can.
I have one. I'll putting it into the to YouTube now, and then I will figure out how to share. I don't think I've ever shared with StreamYard, so let's find out.
I think it's a fair one, pretty much.
So this, I just put on the screen here if anybody wants to, I guess, type.
All right, is it sharing now?
I can click a button and then it will.
Okay.
There we go.
I don't know. Is that flashing for you too?
It is for me.
It is. Maybe stop and share your tab instead of your.
Oh, there we go.
There you go. You're good.
Okay. All right. So this is a small thing, but it has come up a few times that when one of my fellow instructors brought this to my attention. So what I have here is a reactive form that has some information, and I could fill this in to make it valid, and it would make the save button enabled. So if I put in,
make it a little bit bigger. I'm having I just checked, and it's a little bit hard to read on the YouTube. Thank you.
All right. So right now, the save button is disabled because overall this form isn't valid. So I'll put in a bunch of information to make it valid. Sales is already good. Department. I'm my own supervisor because I'm just that cool. And then, okay, so now I have enough in there that the save button's valid or enabled. Now the code on this is right here. So I have a button on here, and I'm using square brackets around disabled, and I am setting it disabled if the details are not valid. And the first time I saw that, I thought, that's kind of silly. Why don't I just say if the details are invalid? Because that's really, isn't that the same thing? And it's less code, and why am I using a not? It's just in general, if you can avoid using a not, the bang, you avoid using the bang. However, and actually, in this particular case, with the situation that we have exactly in this application, it doesn't matter. There would be no difference. But there are times that there is a difference. And the reason is that it's not a situation state. It's not a dichotomy of this form is either valid or invalid. There's a third state of pending. So if we're doing any sort of async validator on here, it will take a while for that validation to happen. It might be calling back to the server to get a response that comes back. And if I say disable this, if it's invalid, that means while we're pending, while we are waiting for the validity to be determined, that button's enabled. And that's almost definitely not what you want. So we just have this weird thing where there's a valid state and an invalid state, but it's not a dichotomy, it's a trichotomy. There's 3 different values. And because of the third value, if you have any sort of asynchronous validation in there, you need to do not valid. And my preference is even on code like this, where all of the validators are synchronous, and so it doesn't actually matter. I do this just so that I don't accidentally make the mistake of setting something in here that I have to hunt down later.
Yeah, that's such a great tip. And like, not even just Angular, but web development is full of things that it's like easy to forget that we're in a mostly asynchronous development environment. And even if the thing you're touching right now, you could argue, well, it's not currently asynchronous. literally the very next requirement you go to implement, it could become asynchronous.
Yeah, it's borderline like a latent bug waiting to happen.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Any other tips that come to mind in this code? I mean, form code is, it's like at the heart of much of what we have to work on, right? Is complex forms, complex behavior.
Yeah.
Anything else that comes to mind?
I don't know if we ever really cover this in the curriculum necessarily, so it's kind of one of those ones that skirts the edges. If you go to the TypeScript,
Hey, wait a second. I want to spot something.
Oh,
There's
hey.
another invalid I just spotted in that same one right there on line 84.
on that actual individual control, that's a good point.
Yeah. In that case, I'm not as worried about it because it is so atomic. Like it is doing a validation on that, but yeah, theoretically, we could be doing a back-end validation on whether the phone number exists.
And that's actually very likely too.
Yeah.
And this one, I guess, if this had an asynchronous bug, it would just be a display bug because it would mean the class is toggled inappropriately. So this is maybe low importance, and the one you just showed us had to do with submitting the form.
Correct.
So it's much more critical to functionality.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
So
great.
go make a PR.
So
thing I was going to talk about, the group syntax and like the kind of, like the array syntax for this. It's kind of interesting because like the first thing you pass in for like initial value, you could either pass in an actual value, or you could straight up pass in like this magic object that has like a disabled property and a value property. And not a lot of people really know about that. But this is one of the great ways of like actually doing proper disabling of controls inside reactive forms. So value like empty string, and then disabled would be another property there.
I don't know if...
I think it's just straight up disabled, but...
I forget what the types are here. Okay, I'm just trying to
It is disabled though, I'm pretty sure. So,
okay.
yeah.
You're
It's
trying
the
to find
same...
the type of it. So there's some complex type.
There is some typing somewhere deep within that.
A few
TS file.
versions ago, a lot of the types that you needed to talk about forms were not exported. They were just kind of used internally. But I think over the last few Angular versions, they have all the types you need to write type-safe code are now
I know that object is in there
exported.
somewhere.
So I would bet that there's a name for that type.
Is this also the same place where you put update on blur? I forget.
I don't believe so, but I don't know.
Yeah, there's another object in here, something like it may. I think it is another property on here, and we just need to find the type where you can define that the form control will not fire its updates as you're typing, but will defer any of the updates until you tab away from it. It's update on blur. But you can see here, I added the disabled true, and that component is truly disabled. So yeah, it is working.
It's a good way to do initialization, and then like again doing the .disable and .enable in the TypeScript. Because if you ever go through the path of like having like disabled on like an input or something in the template, Angular gets very, very mad at you for doing that because it's not like the reactive forms way of doing it. It's more like the template forms.
Yeah, it really doesn't want you to mix reactive and template.
Yeah.
It doesn't. Even though they share most of the code behind the scenes, or much of the code behind the scenes, it really does not like you to mix them. Okay, any other tips in this example?
I mean, there are a lot of little things that really aren't Angular specific, but just remembering the labels. So label for phone and ID of phone means that these two will be connected together, and therefore if I click on the label, then the element itself, or the field will get the focus. But that's not an Angular thing. That's just a web thing.
But it is kind of incredible the amount of just like raw HTML, like JavaScript stuff people forget on making templates sometimes. It's kind of insane.
And I wouldn't even say forget. It's just,
just kind of look over.
Make their different journeys into our industry. Some of us picked up the web like kind of at the beginning of the web. But there are many other folks who were off doing totally unrelated things with their lives until in the beginning of the web, and had no reason to ever care about any of this. Back when
until you get into like accessibility, I guess.
I'm kind of both. I made HTML pages in my dorm room pre-GeoCities, but that was really old HTML when no one really knew what was going on, and didn't come back to being a web developer until I was an Angular developer in 2014. And so there was about 10 years of getting used to these patterns and practices that just, I was off writing Java code. I didn't care. So yeah, I know some of the things from the olden days, but not as much as I probably should.
Yeah, making like an actual accessible website nowadays is a very, very deep dive for anyone who's not done a lot of web experience stuff. If you're just like an Angular developer and having to dive into that, there's a lot you learn about just the individual elements and attributes you use.
Okay. Well, I have another one to share over here. So let me see if I can click the right buttons here. Okay, this one is our. I'm going to go ahead and. Where's the button? Where do I click that button to pop this out? Is there a button I can click to pop it? Or
It's open a new window here right there.
I press that, and that brings it up. Okay.
I'm actually happy you brought up the step. I was going to bring it up too.
Okay, so interesting. So when I'm sharing this way, so normally when I share via some other means, like in a Google Meet, I can just click one button to switch back and forth what tab I'm sharing. But when I share using this machinery, I cannot do that.
Yeah, I typically just end up sharing my entire screen and fill up.
Yeah. I have this thing where, here's a tip far from Angular. If you're going to do a lot of screen shares, just don't buy an ultra-wide monitor because it's an endless pain.
I purposely have like 3 monitors just to make everything easier instead of having like an ultra-wide.
You intentionally got 3 normal-shaped monitors, right?
They're all like 27 or whatever.
Yeah. So the tip is be like Zachary, don't be like Kyle. So in this example, it's doing like an incremental search. So I just like typing a few letters, and it finds the people that match, and you can click on them, and it shows their details. Right. So the how that works is not the nature of the tip. If you want to learn how that works, go study it, or go come to the class. But in here there are some interesting bits of code. And let me see if I can find the one I was thinking of earlier. Yeah, okay. So here's the first one. I thought everybody knew this, but I've met a few people that don't. And that if you're getting errors because sometimes your variables are undefined, like at the very beginning before the data arrives, this question mark, which it's the nullish coalescing operator, is that what that is? No.
Null coalescing.
What is this operator called?
I think people refer to it as like the Elvis operator, but it is like nullish coalescing.
The people make an argument about its shape, but I don't think it.
Yeah, that doesn't really do much for anyone, but it is the nullish coalescing though, because it's like saying if the previous thing that you're looking at is null, just coalesce the entire statement null. Yeah.
And so that's a single character fix to what would otherwise be a problem. And I've met people who solve the problem. They say, "Oh no, don't do that. Go ahead and do an ng if up here," and that's okay. I mean that works, but it kind of disrupts the appearance of the screen more. If you just want to get rid of the error,
almost.
Yeah. If you like the way it looks while it's loading, you just don't want an error. Yeah, like just that one character is it's a very bite-sized tip to go do.
It's actually really nice on the previous step too. If like reactive forms, a lot of those things are like a thing, abstract control or null. So using it there is really nice.
Then here's the next tip. I don't know why StackBlitz is unhappy with this because it works great in normal use. And that is, if you must Lodash, use Lodash ES, Lodash-ES. Hard to say because you're saying dash dash. But Lodash-DS is just a different compilation of Lodash so that all the functions are simply exported as functions. And the idea here is this is automatically tree shakeable. And you don't have to do uglinesses. There's like a way of doing something like this instead, which is and then you have to do the import differently. And you can do all that, but that's more of an abuse of kind of the way that the node package importing works. If you wish you had Lodash, but it exported stuff like a 2021 library would, they have that. It's just you just use Lodash-ES instead. It's the exact same version, the same features, all the same functions are available, but you get to import them like you would guess you would, and then you just use them, and it tree shakes out. It only includes the code for the ones that you actually used.
As a funny side note with that, I've noticed like on my current project, because we actually use just normal Lodash because of weirdness of versioning. But Angular itself, like in the compilation, depending on your settings, actually complains about Lodash because
Yeah,
it's not following that like newer
right.
pattern of doing it.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, we're
Oh
importing
yeah.
all of this, but come on.
If you use it normally, if you literally just import something from Lodash, you're bringing in all of Lodash, even though you had no need for it. Yeah, it's not good if you care about bundle size. Now, a lot of our customer projects here are just enormous things run on big, fast computers, and like adding a little bit of bundle size is pretty far down the list what the decision makers worry about on a daily basis. But if you are worried about bundle size, don't just directly use Lodash. Yeah, you actually have to do that funky / import if you want to use it sort of safely. Okay, then there was another bit in here. I had written this one down as one to mine several bits from. Let me see if I can spot the other small tip. What I'm trying to do, oh yes, yep, this was the tip. Let me see if I can get this code visible. Okay. So you often find that you'd like something that happens in a template to kick off some RxJS thing. And I have seen people write lots of code to do that. You know, they make a subject or a behavior subject, and they write a method that calls a thing on it, and they have to come up with names for all the pieces. And so my tip was that, at least from my point of view, the idiomatic okay way to like connect some kick off an observable chain from something happening on a template is you just make the new event emitter. So this emitter right here, this is exactly what you would write if you were doing any other kind of output. And it's okay to just call that right from the template. You just do it like that. And I think you can call either emit or next on it. Works the same way. But that gets you that gets you the kind of the missing wiring between if I want to handle something that's sitting on a template in an Rx way, yeah, just define an event emitter or a subject. They're about the same thing, and then just call the method on it right from the event handler. It ends up costing you about this many characters of overhead to do that. And there's actually a bunch of discussion on the Angular issue tracker about a hopeful future feature that would have an in-the-box way to wire up from a template into an Rx pipeline. And one of the challenges being addressed there is that people propose alternative syntaxes, which would require new development work to be done to support a new syntax. And those are valuable to the extent they are shorter than what's already in the box. This right here, this has been in the box. We've been able to do this since Angular 2 or since the alphas. And it kind of does the thing you need. So that's the tip about kind of the least amount of work that it takes to take an event that happens in the template and have it kick off an Rx pipeline.
I think a lot of those discussions kind of loop back into like consuming those events. It'd be nice to be able to like consume events in like an RxJS way instead of having to like have a function that consumes that and then you do something with it elsewhere. But
Yeah,
the
that gets to
syntax
the-
is definitely nice.
That gets to the big conversation that
Yep.
we
Should
hear
we
about
RxJS
from the
more?
core Angular team at all the conferences, where they say half of the community, like us, want
Yeah.
more reactive, make everything reactive, and then the half of the community is like, stop the reactivity, we don't want that. So they don't know
Yeah.
which side to please.
That's a hard place for a framework to be in. Like I can see that, like, for historical inertia reasons, it probably pays off to stay where it is. But if you were trying to be competitive with a new framework today, you probably would choose to go all the way one direction or all the way the other.
I think the main thing there is probably just trying to make the RxJS like reactiveness more automatic, so that like it kind of appeases both crowds. Yeah, that's what I was kind of going into that path of like
Yeah.
yeah.
So I wondered if anybody wanted to hazard a tip from this stuff.
Well, okay,
going to
line
talk about
25,
something.
there's a tip that value changes does not start with the initial value. And there are reasons for it, but it surprised me at first. So
Yeah.
if you want to have a pipe that is based off a form control or form group or form array that has all of the values, including the original ones, you have to add that original value yourself.
I actually have another tip. Line 25 is only okay and correct because it's happening in the constructor. If you were doing this exact thing anywhere other than the constructor where it might happen later, it would actually be a bug to do this thing. You need to use a defer in here.
Oh, true.
I thought to mention that too, yeah.
Zachary, do you want to, if you tell me the syntax, I'll type it in here.
Yeah, so the syntax there is mostly doing I don't know if you have to do a merge or not, but typically a lot of times you'll do, like a lot of times I would take the merging of the value changes
Yeah.
and then a defer of an observable value.
Yeah.
So
Somebody picking up breathing on somebody's microphone, so check your microphones.
yeah, for that one, it just be bringing in the merge.
Yeah, okay.
and
I don't want to make
you're good.
I don't want to mess with all that
lot.
in a case where I'm not.
But yeah,
sure
it definitely is
types.
like kind of like one of those latent bugs that a lot of people don't catch. It's
Yeah.
like static start with value versus like an actual value that you need to be compiled whenever the subscribe is called, right?
I'm kind of, yeah, that's right. I'm kind of thinking that we should maybe be teaching it the way that's always correct instead of the way that it's sometimes correct. So yeah. Anyway, so yeah, so the tip is, with the huge caveat, value changes only has the value changes, and you'd kind of like it to be like values instead, that has both the first one and all the changes. I have asked why. The only answer I got was something on the lines of, this is just kind of how it ended up at the beginning, and it hasn't ever made it onto the priorities to provide something in the box that gives you all the values instead of the changes. But you know, I mean, I hold out hope that on Angular 19 or something, we'll be able to go back and delete almost all of our value changes code. Because I think almost every time I'm writing code that uses value changes, I'm adding something to get the first one also. Almost every time.
Yeah, that's like one of those huge differences between like using a subject versus a behavior subject. And
Yeah.
a lot of times for things like this, you want a behavior subject because it's not just
You want the
something
beginning
that's-
one.
Yeah, it's like you're actually needing the values. If you're actually needing the values, you want a starting state.
Yeah.
Versus like a subject is more just used for like, hey,
Right.
I'm raising an event, do something with it. You don't care about the previous events, right?
So the interesting thing is that RX observables are really combining two different ideas are slammed into the same idea, and that you can almost imagine like a successor typing, like a more elaborate typing on top of RxJS that differentiated between event streams and value streams, and like let the type system guide you to not accidentally misuse one for the other.
Yeah.
For just like you were saying, Zach, you're like, if it represents a value, you almost always want the current one as well as all changes. If it represents an event that occurred, you almost always don't want the current, like,
Exactly,
because
yeah.
the most recent one might have been 7 years ago. So if you're talking about events, you only want them going forward. If you're talking about values, you always want the current one. I can imagine having the types somehow help you always get the right thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if this step. Oh, you got it, Lance.
Yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
I'm looking at some of the code from one of the client projects I'm on, and we have a utility function for the control value that you pass in an abstract control, and then it does a merge on the value changes with a start with, which is a defer that wraps an of that value, and then we pipe a share replay on that at the end with one value, and like it. And so then we just have that written as a utility, and we just use that for every place we would otherwise use value changes. And then we have almost the exact same thing for the control status. Yeah, it's once you have it written, it's really easy to do. But the fact that it's just not right there is kind of annoying.
And I feel like to be maximally competitive, that stuff should be in the box. I might be wrong, probably am, but I feel like it should be.
As a side note, I do have another example. I was going to point out a tip, possibly.
sure.
That was
You
in
wanna
your
bring
stuff that
something
you
up?
had.
No, go ahead.
But I'm going to bring up another one that I know for a fact has the thing I wanted to talk about. So this one's going to be like a dual thing because I want to talk about two things inside of it. One's just an RxJS thing, and the other one's like a routing thing. So
I'll take two tips in one.
yeah. So the first thing I wanted to point out, otherwise, like, don't even care about the actual step itself. It's just dealing with, again, form controls and dealing with RxJS is, okay, I think it's shared. So
I'm hitting your button.
there we go. Cool.
Okay.
So the main thing here is, again, we're making use of value changes, disregarding the fact that we might want to start value, all that kind of stuff. But we're also making use of a debounce time, and then we're making use of a distinct until change. And these two operators I see side by side so much because they basically kind of go hand in hand in a lot of cases. Where a debounce time saying, hey, don't let anything come out of this observable until like 300 milliseconds have passed, some type of time has elapsed. And then distinct until change is almost kind of like filtering out the results of that, saying, hey, if we got through the debounce time and there's just the same value still sitting there, don't emit another value. It's like a whole bunch of cleanup, which is really, really nice before you end up hitting like an API or something, which is very cool. And I know we have another step that probably shows it off a little bit better using like a switch map after all of this. But it is very often something that happens when you're going off of like a free text input, making use of these two operators. I don't know if either of you have anything to expand on top of that.
I think that this is one of those bits that's easy to do what you're describing in one line with RxJS, but quite tedious to do if you don't have RxJS, right? Because even though there's a way to ask Angular to debounce a specific control, I don't know of a way to ask Angular to both debounce and deduplicate, which is what you're doing here, a set of controls together. Now there might be. Maybe there's a way to debounce an entire form without calling the Rx debounce directly. But I think this is a good, really great use case for like getting ideal behavior is like this much RxJS.
Yeah, it's definitely nice. Just combining like literally just two operators, single line, gets you a lot of power. Just cool. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to mention here is more routing oriented, and it has to do with query params, which I guess query params in and of themselves are kind of a tip because a lot of people don't really use them. So again, query params are more of that thing like you just it's kind of like if you're doing like your typical Amazon search or something, right? They throw a whole bunch of stuff inside your URL so you can kind of bookmark where you are with your form, if your like checkboxes selected, all that kind of stuff. So in this step, we have the same situation where we have query params, and whenever you click on something, you filter something, it adjusts the query params, yada, yada. The thing I actually want to talk about with this, though, is if you're ever doing like setting up actual query params and you into a case where, let's say I have like a filter term here, this thing up here, so filter equals whatever. And if I were to wipe out that filter term, our current case actually just completely removes that key value pair from the URL and it's nice and clean. But the only reason that's happening is because we're doing some very custom code, which we have a lot of comments around to actually get that result. So in this, like when I first found this out, this kind of blew my mind. I was like, why is this even the case? But it just is. So if I take away this or undefined here, literally all I'm taking away here, if I go back into our code, I just accidentally forked the project, so it'll take a little second. You can see that I now have like a filter equals nothing when my filter term is at empty value. If I type something, I get something. If I remove that, it's just filter equals nothing. And it's kind of like, it's not terrible, but it's kind of, it like reeks of like a non-polished app almost, where you just have things sitting in your URL that don't matter, making it needlessly long, etc. So the main quirk here is the fact that if you pass an undefined value to the actual object you're setting in your query params, it'll remove the key. It's almost as if the key doesn't exist. But if you pass like an empty string or something like that, which is very possible from a form control, it takes that as a real value because a string is a value in terms of the URL, right? And then it actually keeps the key too, which is a little annoying. So I always find this tip kind of funny to show off the first time if you're ever in a class, because there's so much else inside the steps that's kind of boggling your mind. And then I'm just like, oh, by the way, here's this very weird, quirky syntax.
I think that this is code that it needs a 3-line comment to survive code review. Basically. Otherwise, somebody would ask, why on earth would you do or undefined? Like, did you just like accidentally type that? Did you have something else there and you edited? Why would anybody ever do or undefined? And it actually, it creates that exact, precise, polished behavior.
And I guess like another hidden tip in here, I guess, is using query params handling. But if you ever get into dealing with query params, you'll hit that one very, very fast of merging things versus just letting things wipe each other out. So destructive versus additive processes with the query
I see
params.
a tiny tip on here between lines 34 and 36. And that here's something we very often do here, both in our example code and in production code. We chose the name of the variable filter
Yeah.
so that we could use the shortcut syntax on line 36 when we formed an object that had the filter property in it. And that if we had chosen any other name other than the name filter, we would have had to add more syntax.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like having your constants, like the naming of the variables kind of describe the code itself.
Yeah.
And you break everything out like that. It's nice.
And like, I don't know if, there might be some argument that maybe that's bad, right? It's possible that there's some reason why this is not exactly great. But this is a thing we often do and often kind of nudge people toward is name your variables that you're going to use in an object, in a literal object, such that you don't have to rename them as you use them in the literal object. Because it's just less stuff in the way. Well, we're at an hour and 20 minutes here, and I feel like we have delivered dozens of tips at this point. Do we have any final tips before we wrap up our tipping?
I'm just joking because the first tip for me, at least, was how to be evil. So I think maybe, hopefully, we have overall given a good
Positive. Yeah.
yeah, worked our way out of that ethical hole.
We started out in a pretty big hole, but we've dug out of it over the course of an hour and 20 minutes. So
yeah, just a life tip is watch The Good Place with your kids to start conversations about ethics, but that's a different issue.
Yeah, I guess there are podcasts that have a tips section at the end with kind of totally unrelated tips, but we usually don't do those. We figured it's hard enough to get our viewers to make it to the end, even being relevant. We don't yet have viewer interest to spare to diverge too far from our purported area. So, well, I guess thank you, viewers, for viewing, both live and later, and thank you guys for being part of it.
Thank you.
I guess. Bye-bye, viewers.
So yeah.